Everyone, I think it's 4:30, and so we'll start this session now. The clock just turned 4:30 in front of me. My name is Mary Labbe, and I'm professor at University of Toronto, and I'm pleased as my co-chair to Bohan Lahevy, who's at Mount St. Vincent. I got that right. Our session today is a mini review session, and it's Nutrition Beyond Food. And I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker this afternoon. It's Sharon Kirkpatrick. Sharon is a registered dietitian and assistant professor at the School of Public Health and Health Systems at University of Waterloo, and her research focuses a lot on dietary assessments, methodologies, and issues around dietary assessment. So Sharon, it's yours.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me, particularly in this absolutely stunning setting, which is maybe why we don't have a full room, because people are out there enjoying the Rockies. So I don't have any commercial or corporate disclosures. And the question that was posed to me is, can we trust data on dietary intake? So I'm going to start with my quick and dirty answer on the topic, and then I'll move into some of the nuances on this. So like any form of self-report data, self-report dietary intake data are not perfect, but that doesn't mean that they can't provide us with some valuable information. However, there are a number of considerations that we need to keep in mind. Tools are different. They have pros and cons, and so we need to choose our tools carefully. We need to analyze and interpret the data very carefully, and also acknowledge the limitations. Now, this storyline might be a little bit different from what you could have seen in the literature and in the popular media in the past couple of years, where there have been some claims that due to the extent of energy underreporting, self-report dietary data actually have no value whatsoever. And so this mostly came from an analysis of the 24-hour recall data in the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study in the US, but was followed by a number of other commentaries, and then, as I said, also some popular media type stories. And I'm going to come back to this analysis a bit later on in my talk. But first of all, let's just back up and take the bigger picture in terms of what is it that we're trying to do when we assess dietary intake and within the context of obesity research. So we want to be able to characterize diet and eating patterns among populations and population subgroups. We want to be able to better understand how diet relates to health and disease risk, and also we want to inform strategies so that we can improve eating patterns and health and potentially outcomes related to weight in subgroups across the life cycle. So what do we need to know? Typically, when we assess diet, we're aiming to find out things like what was eaten or what drinks were consumed, how much of it was consumed, and also how often is this particular item consumed. We take those data and link them to databases that allow us to talk about the nutrients that were consumed and also food groups, as well as things like diet quality. And often we're also interested in contextual information, such as what other activities a person was engaged in while they were eating, like watching Netflix, for example. So a challenge here is that we're not usually interested in what someone consumes on a particular day, but we're interested in usual or long-term average or habitual intake. For example, in terms of monitoring and surveillance, recommendations are not meant to be met every single day because we can store nutrients. And so in order to compare to recommendations, we again need to have a sense of habitual intake. Same kind of thing for epidemiology or diet disease relationships. It's not what I eat today, but what I eat over time that's going to impact my health or disease risk. And with interventions, again, we're not trying to change what someone consumes at a given meal or on a given day, but over time so that we can have a lasting impact on their health. Now, the big problem here is that usual intake is not observable. So in some ways, we can think of it as being a latent construct. So let's just skip all the self-report stuff and use objective measures. That's some of what we've heard in some of those articles that I showed you a little bit earlier on. And so is this possible? Well, we do have recovery biomarkers that do provide a sense of true intake, but the problem is that we only have these right now for 4 different dietary components. And so that leaves a lot of unanswered questions. As well, even if we had recovery biomarkers or other measures of truth for a wider range of dietary components, they still don't give us all the information that we need or want. We want to know what people are actually putting in their mouths, not just their nutrient status. These recovery biomarkers are very costly and very invasive, and so they're not practical for most studies. And I also mentioned the importance of some of the contextual factors, things like if you were using a mobile device or watching television while you were eating. In order to intervene, we need to understand that kind of stuff, and biomarkers don't give us that information. As a result, in the vast majority of nutrition research, we continue to be reliant on self-report tools. And so where concern comes from in terms of these self-report tools is that there are a range of issues that contribute to error. These include the fact that what we eat changes from day to day across seasons. There's variation in intake, and this variation impacts upon measures that we take for only a day or a couple of days. For example, using recalls or records. There's various other forms of biases. So recall bias, when we ask people to tell us what they ate yesterday or over the past month or year. Reactivity biases, when we ask them to keep track of what they're eating in real time, and that often stimulates people to change what they're doing because they don't want to be judged. Related to that, social desirability biases, which interplay with body weight. Cognitive challenges, so when we have something like a food frequency questionnaire and we ask someone who potentially has limited literacy and numeracy skills to average up how many times they consume this particular food over a long period of time, like a year. That's a really difficult task. Also affecting food frequency questionnaires is sometimes the lack of coverage of foods that are important sources of nutrients in particular subgroups. And then finally, there are issues with our databases that we use to convert into food and nutrient intakes. They might be missing certain foods, they have lack of brand-specific data, and they might be missing data on particular nutrients or other dietary components like trans fats. So it's important, though, to keep in mind that we've known about these issues for a long time. Back to the 1980s. This is a picture of Dr. George Beaton, who was a Canadian leader in this field, and I've included a quote here from the mid-1990s where Dr. Beaton stated that there's always going to be error in our dietary assessments. What we need to do is understand that error, understand its structure, and that will help us to analyze the data in ways that can mitigate that error. And the work of Dr. Beaton and others led to a lot of work to do just that, to understand the structure of the error in dietary data. So what are we talking about when we talk about measurement error? Whether it's diet or blood pressure measurements or weight measurements, whatever it is. It's important to keep in mind that although in diet we're extremely transparent about our error, error affects every measure, or most measures anyway. So measurement error is basically just the difference between a true value and the value that's obtained from a measure. There's two different kinds. So the graph on the left here is showing random error. And with random error, the error can occur in either direction. And the impact is, as you can see here, the distribution from the measure is wider than the true distribution. And so there's excess variation. And the good news is that we can deal with that excess variation with repeat measures. The graph on the right is showing systematic error. And in that case, the measurements deviate from truth in a predictable direction. And you can see in this case that the red distribution measured with systematic error or bias is shifted to the left, and that's showing underreporting. We can also have overreporting, but the tendency is generally towards underreporting. The bad news is repeat measures don't help us deal with this problem. We need measure or reference measures like those recovery biomarkers in order to be able to make corrections for bias. And like I said, we only have recovery biomarkers for 4 dietary components. So there's really not a lot we can do about bias. So why do we care? What are the implications? When we think about surveillance and trying to estimate distributions of intake in a population, so for example, fruits and vegetables, so that we can talk about the proportion of the population that's meeting recommendations, the impact of error, and in this case, with surveillance, we typically are using short-term methods like recalls and records. And the impact here is that, as I said, the distributions are too wide. If we take repeat measures and we use statistical modeling, we can account for that. The distributions, however, will be shifted to the left as well due to that bias that I talked about. In terms of epidemiology, the impact of error is to attenuate associations, and so to bias them towards the null and make it hard to find relationships that actually exist. A second effect is to cause power loss. And this means that when we use a tool that has a lot of error, we need huge samples. And that's why we've seen cohort studies getting bigger and bigger over the years to try to dampen out that power loss. And finally, with interventions, what we can get as a result of error when we're talking about diet as an outcome variable is potentially spurious associations. So associations that don't exist, as well as possibly missing associations that do exist. And this is due to differential error when we're comparing groups and trying to predict an outcome. And this is particularly relevant to body weight, and I'll give you an example of that a little bit later on. So in terms of learning about the error in data collected using different kinds of tools, again, following on from the work of Dr. Beaton and others, there have been a number of validation studies conducted using those measures of truth that I talked about, those recovery biomarkers. There's actually sufficient studies now that these have been pooled together to get a better sense of the types of error that affect data, particularly from 24-hour recalls. Some studies have included food records and also food frequency questionnaires. So I'm going to show you some data about food frequency questionnaires and 24-hour recalls from these data, and first focusing on energy. And so you can see here that the extent of energy underreporting is not small, and this goes back to the issues I raised earlier on about criticisms of this field. These have mostly focused on energy, but they've then been just generalized to dietary intake as a whole. But you see from an FFQ, you could be underestimating energy intake by about 24 to 33%. The degree of underreporting is smaller for FFQs and differs in terms of the age group. So again, this is from studies using recovery biomarkers, which are a measure of truth. How does this compare to studies that have used, for example, prediction equations such as the Goldberg method? So this is a study from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from back in the mid-1990s, which suggested that about 28% of women and 18% of men were severe underreporters. So that's pretty similar to the estimates that I just showed you from the biomarker study. This is Archer et al. This is the study that I told you about in the beginning, and this was the paper that stimulated a lot of criticism. Archer et al. Did this analysis of NHANES, and they suggested that 67% of women and 59% of men reported energy intake so low as to be physiologically implausible. They published this, and they also published a bunch of commentaries to go along with it, one of which stated that just to say that the surveillance of dietary intake or these data are problematic is to say that the Titanic had a buoyancy problem. So very inflammatory about the quality of dietary data. But why are these numbers so different? Well, it turns out that Archer et al. Actually used the wrong cut point. I'm not going to go into the details of the Goldberg method, but I can provide you with some references if you want to read up on it. It's important which cut point you use, and they used one that was meant for individuals when the Goldberg method was first initiated, so individuals, not populations. And way back in 2000, Alison Black, who was part of the Goldberg team, recommended that that cut point not be used. And as I already mentioned, they then generalized the criticisms to all dietary data, not just energy reporting. So let's look at some of the other dietary components for which we have recovery biomarkers. And again, going back to studies that have actually used those biomarkers, we see that underreporting, it's still there, but it's a lot smaller for the other nutrients that we can look at. So protein and potassium, and sodium's another, although I'm not showing it to you here. So look at the 24-hour recalls, 5% underreporting for protein, 0 to 4% for potassium. If we express these relative to energy, so look at protein density and potassium density, we do even better. So suggesting that we are obviously getting some real signal here. So what does this all mean? Well, energy, we can all agree that energy is not well reported. And this makes sense when you think about the nature of dietary data and the nature of foods and beverages. They all contain energy, right? So if you have a little bit of misreporting for every single thing you consumed, coming from either social desirability biases or errors in portion size estimation, that's compounding to give you more error for energy. And so it is recommended that you do not use self-report energy as a marker of caloric intake. Rely on markers of energy balance. I know there's been lots of debates about whether that should be BMI, waist circumference, and I'm not going to go into that controversy, but we do agree in the nutrition field that we should not use energy from self-report. Thank you. However, as I mentioned, density variables look better, so do use energy to adjust other intake variables. Do try to identify implausible reporters and at least take a look at your data. Don't drop them because you're losing a lot of your sample if you do that, but stratify, conduct sensitivity analyses, and then also be cautious when you compare across groups differentiated by body weight and other factors. And this goes back to the differential error I mentioned. And so just to take a closer look at this, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, what this graph is showing is calories along the bottom and distributions in blue, red, and black. The blue is for people, men who reported on food frequency questionnaires. The red is from 24-hour recalls, and the black is doubly labeled water, the recovery biomarker for energy. What this is showing is that the amount of energy consumed by men with and without obesity does actually differ from one of the biomarker studies, but you can't see that when you look at the self-report data from either the recalls or the records. The difference doesn't show up. We see the same thing for women. And so what that means is that everyone's misreporting, but they're misreporting differently based on their body weight status. So then when you try to predict obesity or weight-related outcomes using these data, that's where you get those spurious associations. So moving forward, basically, there's lots of different things we can be doing to use the instruments that we have and the data that we have to get as much insight as possible. So use the best instrument possible to reduce error. From what you've seen and what I've shown you here, that's generally the 24-hour recall. The food record also performs quite similarly. Food frequency questionnaires really have very limited use as a sole instrument. Also take advantage of strengths of different instruments. So I just mentioned FFQs aren't that useful as a sole instrument, but they can be very useful in combination with 24-hour recalls because they do a really good job of picking up foods and beverages that we don't consume regularly, like fish, for example. This is just showing you from 2009 to 2014 the different types of tools that were used in Canadian research, and this is from 92 different studies. We did a review to look at just tendencies in diet assessment in the literature, and over half of studies were using FFQs and screeners, and so on the basis of more recent evidence, we're hoping to see this shift towards the records and recalls. So also continue to improve self-report measures, for example, using technology to pursue advances in biomarkers. Design your studies to allow adjustment for error, so include a reference measure if you can, so you can adjust for bias. Include repeat measures so you can adjust for variation. It's important to remember you can't recover true measurements. You can't use these statistical techniques and then go back and get an individual's true intake. As Kevin Dodd says, a statistician at NCI, you cannot unscramble an egg. Once it's scrambled, it's scrambled. I put a picture here of myself and Kevin at experimental biology this past weekend to remind me to say also befriend a statistician and work with them throughout the process. Continue to pursue advances in analytic techniques. Also, we need more biomarker studies. This on the right here, these are findings that Kevin presented at experimental biology showing interactions between reporting and BMI. When you're reporting on diet assessment, tell us about the methods that you use. It's not okay to just say this FFQ has been validated, period, and then not to mention measurement error. I'm running out of time if you can't tell. In terms of closing the gap between what we know we should be doing and what's actually happening, there's lots of resources out there. I'm happy to share these with anyone afterwards. But just to finish, so what have we learned from self-report data? Yes, there are some problems, but we've learned lots about diet quality, things like meal and snacking patterns, the major sources of things like added sugars, as well as contextual factors. So it's really important that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and use the methods we have appropriately while we continue to try to improve them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirkpatrick. We have time just for one quick question. If there are no questions, thank you very much.
Good thing I used all my time.
Our next presenter is Dr. Dana Olstad, and her presentation is Can Policy Ameliorate Socioeconomic Inequities in Obesity and Obesity-Related Behavior? Dr. Olstad is Assistant Professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary.
Great, thank you. So I also have no disclosures. Oops. So I am at the University of Calgary now, but I actually just came back from Australia on March 31st, and it snowed 3 times since I've been home. So yeah, it's quite a shock. But so I am going to speak to you about work that I completed in Australia at Deakin University. So socioeconomic position refers to people's social and economic position in relation to others. It's typically measured using education, income, occupation. Now we know that people of lower, I'll use SEP to mean socioeconomic position throughout this presentation. So people with lower SEP tend to have higher rates of obesity and poorer dietary and physical activity behaviors. And in this slide, it's showing some data from Australia where you can see there's a clear educational gradient in terms of obesity risk. In Canada, actually, at an overall level, obesity does remain concentrated among the poor. However, inequities in obesity have actually decreased over time, which is positive. So why might SEP impact health? Well, there's a whole variety of explanations. For example, it could be that neighborhoods are unsafe in lower SEP areas, so people don't get outside to be physically active. They may have higher levels of stress, and we know that cortisol directly increases visceral adiposity. You'll notice that all the factors here are really not necessarily so much under individual control. It's really people's life circumstances that influence their risk of obesity. And so this presents an opportunity for policy to intervene because policy is a really powerful tool in order to change environments. So when we talk about reducing inequities, there are 2 major policy types that we generally would consider. And these would be universal policies, which apply to the entire population. So something like nutrition labeling. Then there's targeted policies that specifically focus on disadvantaged groups. For example, subsidized transit passes. So we did 2 systematic reviews that I'm going to speak to you about today to examine the impact of these types of policies on inequities in obesity and obesity-related behaviors. The first one is published in Obesity Reviews. So the first study was looking at the impact of universal policies on socioeconomic inequities in obesity, dietary, and physical activity behaviors in adults and children. We followed PRISMA equity guidelines. We searched 3 databases from 2004 to 2015, and to be included, studies had to consider healthy adults or children. We included all quantitative study designs, so they could have been uncontrolled or controlled studies. They had to involve, though, a real-world universal policy, so nothing in a simulated setting, nothing on the internet. They had to look at differential effectiveness by SEP for at least 2 groups and had to consider an anthropometric dietary or physical activity behavior. So we started with 18,000 papers. We had to screen nearly 600 papers in full text because a lot of these subgroup analyses would not necessarily be reported in titles or abstracts. And we ended up with 36 studies included. So we extracted all the data in duplicate, and we also rated study quality. Now, we used an existing scheme in the literature to classify the types of policies. First, on one end of the continuum, we have agentic policies. And these are typically policies that provide information, and they don't make very strong or sometimes any changes to environments. And in order to take advantage of them, people actually have to think through and use the information, for example, nutrition labels. And at the other end of the continuum, we have structural policies. And these typically will change environments very strongly. They might constrain choice in some way, such as, for example, eliminating sugar-sweetened beverages. And in between, we would have agento structural policies. And these are policies that would make some changes to environments and might also limit choice in some way, but people still have full choice in this situation. It could be, for example, taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. So the framework posits that the impact of agentic policies on inequities would be negative. This is because lower SEP groups would be less likely to have the resources to actually avail themselves of these policies. The impact of structural policies was projected to be either positive or neutral, and that might be because lower SEP groups could be more constrained by the contents of their environments. And the impact of agental structural policies was uncertain, as there is very little evidence about that. So we then rated the impact of each policy on inequities as positive, meaning lower SEP groups responded more favorably, neutral if both groups responded in a similar manner, or negative if lower SEP groups responded less favorably to the policy. So in the end, each study could have up to 3 overall impact ratings, one for each of the outcomes, and we also combined children and adults together because the framework did not suggest that there would be any difference by age. So for example, in a study, if there were 5 associations examined, 1 was positive and 4 were neutral, then the overall impact of that policy on diet in this example would be characterized as neutral. So we had 36 studies with 50 overall impact ratings. Most were conducted in the US. Most of them were moderate quality studies, and most were repeat cross-sectional. Most of the policies were agental structural, as you can see, and the total exceeds 36 here because some of the papers examined multi-component policies that could have been classified into multiple domains of the framework. And it's important to note that just 4 of the 10 agentic policies were standalone, meaning they were implemented without any other types of policies like structural policies. Many of the studies were conducted in schools, but a large number were also conducted in communities. The sample sizes were generally large, and most studies were in children. So now I'll just orient you over here. This is the screen that I can see more easily. So the black bar is the overall impact for each of the types of policies which are listed along the bottom. So we have agentic, agento-structural, and structural. The number of studies is on the vertical bar. So if we just look at the black bar, which is combining all the outcomes together, you can see that for each type of policy, the impact was very strongly neutral. You can see that for all 3 policy types. And if we look here, we can see the percentages. So again, you'll see that over 60% of all 3 types of policies had neutral impacts. And what is also interesting to note is that the impact of agentic policies and structural policies was remarkably similar, even though they're at opposite ends of the continuum. Now we also we just listed each individual policy to see if we could actually figure out, well, were some policies more likely to have positive or negative impacts on inequities? And for the most part, we couldn't find any patterns here because you can see school nutrition policies, for example, had both positive, neutral, and negative impacts. But what we did find is that fiscal policies, including subsidies and taxes, had consistently positive or neutral impacts on inequities. So you can see there are taxes on unhealthy foods in Hungary and on, I can't even read that from here. You probably can't either. There's US state-level soda taxes and free fruit and veg programs in schools, and these are across a number of countries, so that was quite an interesting finding. Now, as I mentioned, just 4 of 10 agentic policies were actually standalone, but of those 4, 1 actually had a positive impact on inequities, 2 neutral, and 1 had a negative impact, and of those 4, it was the only weak study. So this is pretty interesting as well. So at minimum, the 60% neutral finding for agentic policies suggests that it's possible to ameliorate any negative impacts they might have by including policies with a structural component. So what we found is that most policies did not alter inequities, but at the same time, very few of them actually narrowed inequities. So there's room for improvement, obviously, here. Distinctions between agency and structure may have little practical importance in predicting the impact of policy on inequities, and a comprehensive approach should probably include both. Fiscal measures, including subsidies and taxes, had consistently neutral or positive impacts on inequities. So this led us to wonder, well, how can we actually use policy to narrow, not simply maintain inequities? So another potential is to augment universal policies with policies that are targeted to the needs of disadvantaged groups. So this was the subject of our next systematic review, which was just published 3 or 4 days ago in Obesity Reviews. So here we're synthesizing evidence from controlled studies only pertaining to the impact of targeted policies. So again, controlled studies only, healthy non-pregnant adults or children. Policies had to target disadvantaged individuals or all persons in a disadvantaged setting. They had to include our 3 outcomes. And we excluded studies that related exclusively to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the US, and that's because they've been reviewed extensively. So again, here we use the same screening process, and we had 20 studies in this one. So we classified policies as whether they were organizational. So this could be, for example, a school-initiated nutrition policy. And government policies were specific policies enacted by governments. So in this case, it could still be implemented in a school, but in that case, it would be, say, a province had actually mandated that the policy must be implemented in all schools. So we rated policy impact again. Here it's a bit different though, because we're not looking at disadvantaged and advantaged people. We're only looking at groups of disadvantaged people. So we're comparing outcomes in treated and uncontrolled groups, or treated and untreated groups. So the impacts could have been positive, neutral, or negative, but none of the studies found negative impacts. So here each study could have up to 6 overall impact ratings, and that's because we separated the results for adults and children. And we dichotomized the outcomes. So we wanted to know, were there no positive impacts or were there some positive impacts? So if there were 3 of 6 positive or 2 of 6 positive, that would have still been rated as positive, versus 0 of 6 was the only one that would get no impact. So here we had 18 studies, 20 papers, 25 overall impact ratings. Again, most studies are in the US. The studies were strong in quality because, again, they were all controlled. Fairly even distribution between organizational and government policies, but the vast majority of studies here were conducted in schools. Fairly large sample sizes, but the clusters were not necessarily always large. And most of the evidence was in children 7 to 12 years of age. So if we look at the outcomes divided by organizational versus government policies, if we look at them in terms of our 3 outcomes of anthropometrics, diet, or physical activity, we see a little bit more success in changing diet. In terms of the organizational policies, all of them were conducted in schools. So that means there were no organizational policies implemented in adults. They were all very high quality though. They were long-term, comprehensive. They engaged families, schools, and communities. And 6 of the 7 interventions had some positive impacts. And the common elements were requiring foods to meet nutrition standards, offering physical education, physical activity, school self-assessments, education as well. But the problem was they were all multi-component interventions, so we couldn't actually attribute any of the beneficial impacts to the policy per se, and many of them actually didn't really describe their policies very well. Just one intervention had no positive impacts, and it was not obviously dissimilar from the interventions that had positive impacts, so that was a difficulty as well. We couldn't really figure out why it did not succeed. Now here's where things get a little bit more interesting. You can see here that almost all of the outcomes in children are positive, and none of the outcomes in adults were positive. Now, when we look at the different policy types, we could characterize all of the government policies into 3 broad categories. So providing information and education had positive impacts in children, no positive impacts in adults. Fruit and veg subsidies, positive in children, no impacts in adults. And changes to built environments, we would actually characterize these as no positive impacts in any population, because the one association that was positive in children was really fairly inconsequential. So to summarize, what we found was that for the organizational policies, they were mostly positive outcomes, but they were all in schools. There were no studies in adults. For the government policies, the results in children were mostly positive, and most, again, were in schools. For adults, they were all in communities, but there was no impact. Now, I should also caution that, as you probably saw earlier, most of those comparisons are only based on comparing 2 to 4 studies in each instance, so we're not dealing with a large number of studies. So for this review, we really found that the largest quantity of high-quality evidence of effectiveness was for school-based interventions that had an organizational policy component. But again, it was difficult to attribute any positive impacts to policy. Government policies also had a good evidence base, and these were primarily free fruit and veg programs in schools. Now, we can see from this review that schools provide a relatively supportive context for high-quality interventions, but there was less evidence in other settings. So that does not mean that interventions in other settings are not effective. It just means that we really didn't have the evidence to be able to assess that. So there's clear gaps in knowledge related to what policies work in very young children, adolescents, and adults. So if we combine the findings from our 2 reviews in terms of inferring what is the role of policy in addressing obesity-related inequities, well, in terms of what we know, most evidence is really from the US. We don't know a lot about other countries. But an equity-oriented approach to obesity could involve universal fiscal policies, as these appear unlikely to actually exacerbate inequities. And these could be complemented by targeted organizational policies and government fruit and veg programs in schools. However, ultimately, we're really just addressing the behavioral manifestations of deeper issues. So what we really need to do is to use policy to address those social processes that result in unequal distribution of determinants of health in the first place. These are called generally the social determinants of health inequities. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Kylie Ball, Megan Tyshen, Robin from Deakin University, and Leah Miniker, who's in the audience here as well, and Kim Rain, who's also in the audience, and Candace Nikiforik, and Daniel Tabor from the University of Washington. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
We got questions for Dana? Well, maybe I'll ask you one then. We've got half a minute here. When you were looking at your policies and you're most of it in children, do you think that it's because there's so many other factors in adults? Like, you know, obviously there's 2 things going on. There's just not that many studies. Or do you think the environment is such a bigger player in adults? Like, what do you sort of attribute that difference?
We hypothesize that it could be because disadvantaged adults in particular are really just, their attention is probably really consumed with just getting by in the day, whereas kids wouldn't necessarily have those concerns. So they might, and they've had a longer time in order to entrench certain behaviors throughout their lives. So their body weight and behaviors might just be more resistant to change. Hard to say, though.
Thank you very much. Okay, our last speaker is Gordon Zello, and Gordon is a professor in nutrition in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Saskatchewan. So, Gordon, and I've lost your topic in front of you. I have to switch screens, but
They haven't put it up.
Hasn't put up yet.
All right. So, as one of the organizers of this meeting, I have a few comments to make before I begin. First of all, I think the title of this session changed. First of all, I think a word got dropped. It should have been nutrition beyond food intake, because all I'm talking about is food. So, and anyways, I can't remember the second one, so we'll just move on. Oh, I know. I put myself last on purpose, but you're still all here, but thanks for that. So I have nothing to declare. I really don't have any commercial support, but those are the funders that funded the work I'll talk about, and therefore I have no mitigating bias either. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today are some of the research on pulses specifically, but there's many other studies that have looked at food without changes in caloric intake. So dietary interventions that don't also include reducing intake in subjects as part of the design. So pulses are really basically just low-fat legumes. That's the way I like to think of them. So they don't include soy or peanuts, basically. And you can see that they have some very fascinating ingredients that should make them very good and very healthy, as well as a carbohydrate load that is low GI. I should mention, though, that the GI of pulses will change during processing. So if you use pulse flours, for example, you're going to get a different GI. So in all the studies we carry out, we use whole pulses. So we know for a long time, especially in developing countries, that pulses are really important for growth and development. In an adult diet, it's been shown to be beneficial in reducing colon cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity, maybe in a way that we usually don't think of, and I'll touch on that, and heart disease. And Bodan here, the co-chair, has done many studies on reducing short-term appetite by pulses, and he'll be speaking, I think, tomorrow. So I'll talk about two studies that we did. The first being looking at women with polycystic ovary syndrome and examining how a pulse-based diet with the exercise intervention affects metabolic parameters. And this work was just recently, actually earlier this week, presented by my postdoc, Laura McBeardy, in Chicago at the EB meetings. So what is PCOS? It's a complex disorder with many metabolic abnormalities. It's the most common in women of reproductive age, affecting about 1.4 million Canadian women. And aside from infertility, there are other metabolic complications like insulin-resistant dyslipidemia, dysglycemia, and a high risk for developing metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And obviously with the numbers, there's a great health burden also. So the characteristics of PCOS is male patterned hair, anovulation, and polycystic ovaries, which just means an abundance of ovaries that are follicles that appear. So our first objective was to examine the prevalence and characteristics of metabolic syndrome, impaired glucose tolerance, type 2 diabetes, and risk factors for cardiovascular disease in reproductive age women of reproductive age with PCOS using a large Canadian database. So this is probably the largest I've seen from one group, and this is our group of 279 individuals. 42 of them were control. So you can see on this slide that women who were overweight or were obese had higher rates of metabolic syndrome, and these are all women with PCOS. So this was maybe not surprising, but it's certainly something to consider when you're treating these individuals. I'm not going to go through these slides, but I wanted to include them so that they can be included when the slides are posted. So I'll just go to the results. So there's a lot of data there for you to look at. But basically, what we found was women with PCOS exhibit higher cardio risk factors, including BMI, systolic blood pressure, abdominal obesity, dyslipidemia, impaired glucose tolerance, type 2 diabetes when compared to the age-matched controls. Women with PCOS or PCOS and metabolic syndrome exhibited higher male patterned hair, blotches on their skin, worse lipid profile, glycemic control, higher incidence or appearance of inflammation, male hormones when BMI adjusted than BMI adjusted counterparts without metabolic syndrome. So the belief here is that impaired insulin secretion and function are likely the driving forces for PCOS adverse outcomes. So our second objective was to carry out a clinical trial that compared the pulse-based diet with standard therapy. So what we were looking at here was lifestyle modifications. So we were looking at a healthy diet without weight loss, or at least without intentional weight loss. So again, we weren't calorically restricting these individuals, and exercise. Could have been some behavioral modification, but we did do questionnaires to look at how they felt, quality of life questionnaires as well, but those haven't yet been analyzed. So the two diets the subjects were on or randomized to were a TLC diet, which is from the National Cholesterol Education Program. So you can see it's a fairly healthy diet, and a pulse-based diet where the subjects were given 150 grams of pulses dry weight provided in 2 meals. And the rest of the day, the subjects followed the TLC diet, and they were allowed to eat as much or as little as they wanted. So the study protocol was just published in BMC Nutrition. I can't see it from here, so you'll have to look at it yourself. But basically, we screened a lot of people, and we then did, using the criteria for PCOS, and then we did randomization. And what we're currently doing is following up with these patients at six subjects at 6 months and 1 year to see if they're staying on, or if they've learned to stay on the diet and continue with exercise. This doesn't want to move forward. Oh, whoops, no, it went too far. So in the end, we screened 324 subjects, randomized 94, and 61 individuals completed the intervention. So we had about a 35% dropout rate, which is not unusual for these individuals. So if you look at studies in women with PCOS, dropout rates range up to 50%. So I think we did pretty good. The compliance to the diets were surprisingly, I thought, very good. Mean adherence was 5.1 days per week for the TLC group, so that's pretty good. And for the pulse-based group, the average intake, remember they're getting 2 meals a day, so that would be 14 meals a week, was 11.2, and they completed about 74% of the pulses that they were given. And they're getting 150 grams of dry pulses, so that's multiply that by about 2 when you cook it. So they're eating about 300 grams of wet pulses, or maybe a little less. So we did a whole bunch of different outcome measures. I'm not going to report on all of them. I'll focus on the ones that we've analyzed, which is the glucose and blood lipid measurements, as well as some body composition. So for the rest of the slides, you're going to see the pulse-based diet group in green and the TLC diet in red. Now remember, we expected the TLC diet to also be positive because it is standard therapy. Obviously, that had to be our control group. We couldn't have people enroll in this study and not treat them with standard therapy. So you can see that for body composition, I think is that BMI? BMI, both groups lowered their BMI. For fat mass, they were both decreased. For whole body fat, they decreased. And for muscle mass, there was also an increase. However, when we get to the lipid profiles, you can see that the pulse-based diet improved low-density cholesterol better, or better than the TLC diet. Similarly, the cholesterol, the HDL, cholesterol to HDL level went up in the pulse-based diet. The triglycerides went down in the pulse-based diet, and the high-density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol, also went up in the pulse-based diet. With regards to our glucose tolerance test, insulin, again, went down post-intervention for both groups, but it looks like better for the pulse group. And again, for glucose, total glucose, both groups were reduced after the intervention study. Maybe I should say how long the intervention was. It was in the slide, but I couldn't see it. It was a 16-week intervention where they received both the diet and, again, exercise. I think I just showed that. Also, you can see that there was an improvement in the polycystic ovaries, so there's a decrease. So you can see how quite high they were before, and they're still high. They're still above what we would consider acceptable, but there was a decrease in both the left and right side in both diets. We did do some questionnaires just looking at pulse consumption. We did a pulse consumption questionnaire that we've used in the past. You may or may not know pulse consumption is very low in Canada. Lentils, for example, just give you the lentil example. Saskatchewan, where I'm from, is the world leader in growing lentils, and 98% of all the lentils grown in Saskatchewan are exported. So one of the things we always want to find out is why we're not eating pulses. So the biggest barriers were lack of preparation knowledge, time constraints, the belief that pulses take long time to cook, but there are actually varieties that take 10 minutes to cook, so it's just as short as pasta or less, or it's definitely shorter than rice. And there's a belief that pulses do not taste good. However, there was also knowledge that people knew that pulses were good for you, and they also thought it was affordable. So looking at these same types of questions afterwards, obviously, well, not maybe obviously, but the ones that were introduced to pulses had a better attitude and belief towards them after the study. And also general knowledge improved in the group that was receiving the pulse-based diet. So we're hoping that that idea and that belief will also change behavior, and that's why we're doing the 6 to 12-month follow-up. And the other thing we did was we actually came up with a pulse-based diet recipe booklet, and this was based on 6 years of trying to get, well, not trying, but understanding what women with polycystic ovary syndrome would eat and wouldn't eat. A lot of the pulse-based products that are out there are not necessarily healthy because they're full of sugar and other things that make it tasty, right? So we had to come up with a even Pulse Canada has cookbooks out with pulses that, again, may not be healthy. So this is an evidence-based recipe book that's, low in sugar, low in fat, and still has tasty pulse-based meals. And we're hoping to get this published so that everybody can have hold of that. So the conclusions are that a pulse-based diet was equally effective as the TLC diet in improving many measures, but the pulse-based diet was more effective in improving lipid profiles in the women with PCOS. The second study I briefly want to touch, it won't go too long, is looking at the health benefits of eating a low glycemic carbohydrate, in this case lentils. And there you can see a picture of all the beautiful lentils grown in Saskatchewan, after exercise, and this was published last year. So this is a very interesting study because we always associate healthy lifestyle with food and exercise. So one of the things that we know is that an increase in blood triglycerides after eating a meal is a strong risk factor for heart disease. And we know that exercise is beneficial in reducing triglyceride response after breakfast the next morning. Okay? So bear with me here. So the benefit of this exercise is eliminative if foods with a high glycemic index are eaten after an exercise session. So if you exercise and then eat a high glycemic meal, the next day the benefits will be lost after breakfast. So that's a study in obesity. So everybody wants to eat after exercise, or we tell them to eat, get their calories back. But the problem here is that if you're eating the wrong foods, it might have a bad effect. So what we did was after exercise, fed individuals a pulse-based diet and then saw how it affected their lipid levels. So this was a crossover design. So 23 individuals who were overweight or obese did all 4 of these conditions. So after evening exercise, they didn't eat anything. After evening exercise, they had a low glycemic meal, lentils, or they had a high glycemic meals made of potatoes and white bread, or they had no exercise and no foods. And the exercise sessions involved walking for 90 minutes. The next morning, they had a high-fat breakfast, which was a sausage and egg McMuffin from McDonald's, so that might be my conflict of interest. I don't know. And in the right portion to their energy requirements. So some people ate half, some people ate, 3, I guess, I don't know. And then we did blood sampling for insulin and triglycerides and also measured fat oxidation. So here you can see the effects. This one showing insulin response. So this is after they ate the McDonald's meal. You can see that the exercise in lentil groups was superior to all others. And you can also see that eating the potatoes the night before wasn't very good, so we replicated the previous results. With regards to fat oxidation, again, the lentil group did fairly well. They oxidized more fat. I think the color's changed here, and it's blue. And when looking at the triglycerides level, again, you can see exercise and lentils showing very nice blood triglycerides. So this is after they've eaten a high-fat meals, and they're not going up. Those triglycerides are not going up, or not much anyways, compared to the others. So in summary, a low glycemic meal eaten after exercise session is beneficial for increasing fat oxidation and reducing triglyceride response to a high-fat breakfast. This is again most likely due to insulin levels after a low glycemic meal. So overall conclusions from the talk today are that pulses are beneficial in improving metabolic parameters in individuals who are overweight and or have PCOS. And the improvements are apparent without caloric restriction. And second, in individuals who are overweight, consuming pulses after light exercise sustains the benefits of exercise on metabolic parameters the next day. And here are my many acknowledgements. And thank you. Right on time.
Thanks, Gordon, for interesting presentation. I have a quick question. Maybe I have missed this. In your first study with women with PCOS, did you use only lentils, or it was
No,
mixed
thank you.
pulses?
No, thank you for that. No, we used all the pulses possible. So, and again, we fed them as whole pulses, so we didn't look at the individual effects. I mean, you can't be on 16 weeks of just chickpeas, so I don't think.
Yep. Thank you. Is there any other questions? Yeah. If not, thank you very much, all our presenters, for wonderful, interesting presentations, and all of you for attending this session. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.